The Arizona sun was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth as Nathaniel Carson rode out from Tombstone. The year was 1884. This land was still wild, still untamed, and Nate, at 55, felt like he was a part of it. Weathered, broken, long past expecting anything good from life. He was a preacher once. Can you believe that? A man of God, but God had taken his wife, Martha, and his little girl, Sarah, 5 years back. A flash flood. One night, a wall of water washed away his family, and it took his faith right along with them. Now he just had the North Star Ranch, a spread he'd built with his own two hands, a place to be alone, a place to forget. As his horse crested the final ridge before his valley, he saw it, a dark plume of smoke, thick and oily black, staining the perfect blue sky. That wasn't a rancher's fire. That wasn't controlled. That was the kind of smoke that meant only one thing: trouble. He dug his heels into his mare's flanks. "Come on, girl," he urged, his voice a low rasp. The horse didn't need telling twice. She broke into a dead gallop, eating up the dusty ground, her hooves pounding a frantic rhythm against the silence of the desert. The smoke led him to a small clearing. What he saw there made the blood in his veins run cold. A covered wagon, tipped on its side, its canvas roof engulfed in a curtain of roaring, angry flames. And on the ground nearby, two bodies, a man and a woman, sprawled in the dirt like discarded dolls. Their stillness was absolute, final. Nate slid from the saddle before his horse even came to a full stop, his Colt revolver already in his hand. The air was thick with the smell of burnt canvas and something else, something metallic and grim. This wasn't a random robbery. The bodies weren't just shot. They were executed, face down, brutal. The woman had fallen a few yards from the man, one arm stretched out toward the burning wagon, as if she was reaching for something, or someone. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it over the crackle and pop of the fire. A tiny whimper, small, frightened. Nate's eyes snapped toward the overturned wagon. He moved slowly, his boots crunching on the dry ground, his pistol held ready. The attackers could still be watching. Waiting. The sound came again, a little louder this time. A sob choked off by terror. He knelt down, his old knees protesting, and peered into the deep shadows beneath the wagon's wooden frame. And that's when two eyes stared back at him. They were wide, terrified, and as green as new spring grass. They belonged to a little girl, no older than 8. She was pressed flat against the dirt, clutching a raggedy doll to her chest like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Her auburn hair was matted with dust. A small, bloody cut marked her forehead, but it was her eyes that held him. They were a silent scream, a desperate plea. Nate holstered his weapon, his heart giving a painful lurch in his chest. "Hello there," he said, his voice softer than he'd used it in years. "I'm not going to hurt you." The child flinched, shrinking even further into the darkness. "Please," she whispered, her voice a trembling thread. "Please don't let them take me." Her tiny fingers tightened on the doll. "I promise I won't tell anyone." Something cracked open inside of Nate Carson. A wall he'd spent 5 years building, brick by painful brick. Those eyes. They were Sarah's eyes. His Sarah. For a horrifying, gut-wrenching moment, he wasn't in this sun-scorched clearing. He was back at the creek's edge, screaming his daughter's name as the black water rose and rose and rose. He found his voice, though it felt like it belonged to another man. "No one's taking you anywhere," he said, the words a promise he had no idea if he could keep. "You're safe now." "They killed Mom and Papa," the little girl said, the tears finally coming, hot and silent. "The bad men, they were looking for something." Nate nodded slowly, the grim reality of the scene settling on him like a shroud. "What's your name, little one?" "Abigail Sullivan, but everyone calls me Abby." Her gaze darted past him, back toward the open trail, her fear a palpable thing. Are they coming back?" "Not while I'm here," Nate promised again, the words tasting like a lie in his mouth. He spent the next several minutes coaxing her out, gently, patiently. When she finally crawled from her hiding place, The full horror of her ordeal was written on her small frame. Her blue dress was torn and filthy. Her face was pale with shock. "My papa," she said suddenly, her voice gaining a strange, adult-like resolve. She looked toward the body of the man. "I need to say goodbye." Nate hesitated. A child shouldn't have to see this. But the look in her eyes told him she had already seen far worse. He took her small, trembling hand in his own calloused one and led her to her father. She knelt, placing her tiny palm on the man's still shoulder. "Goodbye, Papa," she whispered, her voice clear and steady. "I'll remember everything you taught me." The dignity in that small voice nearly broke him. He'd known hardened soldiers who didn't have a fraction of this little girl's courage. After she said her farewells, he lifted her onto his horse, settling her in front of him. "We'll come back for them," he said, the words feeling hollow. "Give them a proper burial. But right now, we need to get you safe." And that's when they heard it. The unmistakable sound of approaching horses. Lots of them. Abby's fingers dug into his arm like talons. Her breath hitched. "It's them," she breathed, the terror back in full force. "It's them." Nate turned, his hand hovering over the butt of his Colt. 5 riders appeared on the ridge, dark silhouettes against the harsh afternoon sun. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a perfectly trimmed beard, spurred his horse down the slope, his eyes taking in the entire gruesome scene with a cold, calculating calm. Nate recognized him instantly, and his heart sank. It was James Blackwood, the wealthiest, most powerful man in the territory. A man who owned mines, politicians, and from the looks of it, a whole lot of trouble. "Well now," Blackwood called out, his voice smooth as polished silver as he reined in his horse. "Seems we've come upon a tragedy." Nate shifted, subtly positioning himself and his horse to keep Abby shielded from the newcomers. His hand never strayed far from his gun. "Blackwood," he said, his voice flat, "unusual to find you so far from town." Blackwood dismounted with the easy confidence of a king surveying his kingdom. His expensive suit and polished boots were an insult to the death and dust around them. "We were tracking some desperados," he explained, the lie slipping effortlessly from his tongue. "Heard they'd been attacking travelers in these parts." His gaze flickered to Abby, who was trying to make herself invisible against Nate's chest. "I see you found a survivor," Blackwood said, his eyes lingering on the child. Nate didn't hesitate. The lie came to him fully formed, a shield thrown up against a coming storm. "My niece," he said, his voice like stone. He placed a protective hand on Abby's shoulder. "Just arrived from back east. I was meeting her and her parents halfway." Something glinted in Blackwood's eyes. A flicker of cold assessment. It was the look of a predator that had just seen its prey snatched away. "How fortunate," Blackwood said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "that she has family nearby. Such a terrible accident." "Wasn't no accident," Nate replied evenly. "This was murder. Plain and simple." "Of course," Blackwood nodded gravely, still playing his part. "A tragedy. If there's anything I can do to help—" "We'll manage," Nate cut him off, already turning his horse. "I'll report this to Sheriff Pierce when I get back to town." He started to move away, but Blackwood stepped closer, his voice losing its friendly veneer. "One moment, Carson." The air crackled with tension. "The child may have seen something," Blackwood pressed, his eyes boring into Nate. "Witnessed something that could help us track these killers." Nate met his gaze without flinching. "She's been through enough. Whatever questions you have can wait." "I understand your concern," Blackwood persisted, his politeness a thin mask for something hard and ugly. "But if she saw anything—" "She didn't," Nate interrupted, his voice firm as bedrock. "She was hiding under the wagon the whole time. Didn't see a thing." Blackwood's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to the terrified child. "Is that true, little girl? You didn't see who did this terrible thing?" Abby clutched her doll, her whole body trembling. Nate could feel her shaking against him. "Leave her be, Blackwood," Nate warned, his voice dropping to a low growl. A long, tense silence stretched between them. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the nervous shifting of the horses. Finally, Blackwood stepped back, a thin, cold smile playing on his lips. "Of course. Family comes first, after all." As Nate urged his horse away, Blackwood called after them, his voice casual but laced with poison. "Carson, strange coincidence finding you out here today." "Just passing through," Nate called back over his shoulder. "Give my regards to Rose Chen," Blackwood added, the words landing like a physical blow. "Remarkable woman. Still making those herbal remedies of hers, is she?" Nate went rigid in the saddle. Rose was his housekeeper. The casual mention of her name wasn't friendly. It was a message. It was a threat. "I know where you live. I know who is in your house. I can reach you." "Good day, Blackwood," Nate said, his voice tight, and he rode away without looking back. He could feel the man's gaze on him, a physical weight on his shoulders. He could feel the danger coiling around them, tightening its grip. They rode for a long time in silence, the only sound the clop of the horse's hooves on the dry, unforgiving ground. Abby was a small, tense weight against his chest. Finally, when the smoking wagon was just a bad memory on the horizon, she spoke, her voice a tiny whisper against his shirt. "Did you know those men?" "One of them," Nate admitted, his jaw tight, "James Blackwood, owns half the territory." Her next words chilled him to the bone. "He's one of them," she whispered. "One of the bad men. I saw him. I saw him talking to the others before." She broke off, a sob catching in her throat. Nate's world tilted on its axis. It wasn't just that Blackwood was there. He was involved. He was the one giving the orders. And Nate had just lied to his face, claiming the only witness to the man's crime was his own family. He had just painted a target on his own back, and worse, on the back of the terrified child in his arms. The question swirled in Nate's mind like a dust devil. Who were Abby's parents? What did they have that a man as powerful as Blackwood would kill for? And what in God's name was he going to do with a little girl who had seen too much? The logical part of his brain, the part that had survived the war and 5 years of crippling grief, told him to ride straight to town. Hand her over to Sheriff Pierce. Let the law handle it. A broken-down rancher who could barely take care of himself was no guardian for a traumatized child. But then he glanced down at the small auburn head resting against his chest. He saw those green eyes in his mind's eye, so much like Sarah's. He heard her desperate plea, "Please don't let them take me." Something shifted in the barren landscape of his heart, a seed of purpose, long dormant, beginning to sprout. By the time the North Star Ranch came into view, nestled in its valley of cottonwoods, the sun was a fiery orange ball sinking behind the mountains. This place hadn't felt like home in 5 years. It was just a place he existed, a collection of buildings filled with ghosts. But as he rode into the yard with Abby in his arms, it felt different. It felt like a sanctuary, a fortress. Rose Chen came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She was 62, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that saw everything. She'd come to work for Nate after her own husband was killed in the anti-Chinese riots that had swept through the mining towns. She knew tragedy. She knew loss. Her welcoming expression melted into one of deep concern as she saw the child. "Mr. Carson," she called, her voice sharp, "what has happened?" Nate dismounted, then gently lifted Abby down. "Rose, this is Abigail Sullivan. She's going to be staying with us for a while." Rose's perceptive gaze took in the torn dress, the haunted look in Abby's eyes, the death grip on the ragged doll. Without a word, she knelt down to the child's level. Her presence was a small island of calm in a sea of chaos. "Hello, little one," she said softly. "You must be very tired and hungry." Abby gave a tiny, hesitant nod, staying glued to Nate's side. "Rose will take good care of you," Nate assured her. "She makes the best apple dumplings in the territory." "With cinnamon," Rose added, a gentle smile touching her lips for the first time. "Would you like that?" Another small nod. As Rose led Abby toward the house, her hand resting lightly on the child's shoulder, Nate watched them go. The weight of his decision settled on him. He had just declared war on James Blackwood. He had just made himself responsible for a child who was the key to a murder. His foreman, Joshua Miller, approached from the barn. A former slave freed by the war, Joshua had been with Nate from the very beginning. He was a steady, reliable man, and one of the few people Nate truly trusted. "Everything all right, Mr. Carson?" Joshua asked, his eyes following Rose and the strange new child. Nate handed him the reins. No, Joshua, he said, the words heavy as stone. It's not. He told him everything. The fire, the bodies, Blackwood, the lie. As he spoke, Joshua's face grew more and more grave. Blackwood himself was there? Joshua asked, his voice low and tight. That's trouble, sir. Real trouble. That man doesn't dirty his own hands unless something mighty valuable is at stake. I know, Nate said, running a hand through his graying hair. Double the night watch. I want every man with a rifle. Anyone approaches this ranch who isn't expected, I want to know about it. Yes, sir, Joshua paused. And the girl? Nate looked toward the house where a lamp had just been lit in the kitchen window, a small beacon of light in the growing darkness. She stays here until I figure out what in the hell is going on. She's not safe anywhere else. And after that, Joshua asked, the unspoken question hanging in the air between them. What happens to an orphan in a land where the only law is the law of the gun? One day at a time, Joshua, Nate said, his voice grim. For now, she needs a roof over her head. Tomorrow's problems can wait for tomorrow. But as he walked toward the house, Nate knew tomorrow was already here, and it was coming for them with a vengeance. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Rose had already drawn a bath for Abby. The main room was simple, functional. A large stone fireplace, a long dining table, bookshelves filled with books Nate hadn't touched in years. Ghosts lived in this room. The ghost of Martha's laughter, the ghost of Sarah's little feet running across the floorboards. She is bathing, Rose informed him quietly. I found one of Sarah's old nightgowns. It will be big on her, but it is clean. Nate felt a familiar pang of grief at the mention of his daughter's name. Thank you, Rose. The child has seen terrible things, Rose continued, her voice low. There is a deep shock in her eyes. Her parents were murdered right in front of her, Nate confirmed, and Blackwood was there. He asked about you, Rose, specifically. He told her about Blackwood's parting words, the casual mention of her herbal remedies. A shadow passed over Rose's face, a flicker of a pain she kept buried deep. He came to my husband's shop once, before the troubles. He wanted medicines that could make a man talk when he did not wish to. My Chiwin refused him. She turned away, her hands busy with the teapot. 3 days later, the mob came. Nate had never asked for the details of her husband's death. He didn't have to. The anti-Chinese riots had been a stain on the territory, a fever of hatred that had left dozens dead and their businesses burned to the ground. I'm sorry, Rose. I didn't know. She shook her head, dismissing his apology. Old sorrows. But you must understand this man, Mr. Carson. He remembers every slight. He nurtures every grudge. If he is involved in this child's tragedy, then she is in the gravest of danger. Before he could reply, soft footsteps announced Abby's return. She stood in the doorway, swallowed by Sarah's old white nightgown. Her hair was damp and combed, her face scrubbed clean. But the haunted look in her eyes remained. In her hand, she still clutched the ragged doll. Feel better? Nate asked gently. She nodded, then looked around the large, quiet room. Is this your house? It is. This is the North Star Ranch. He gestured to a chair at the table, and Rose immediately set a plate of bread, cheese, and sliced apples in front of her. Abby looked at the food for a long moment, then carefully set her doll down beside her plate before beginning to eat with small, polite bites. Nate watched her, 100 questions burning in his mind, but he held them back. The child was exhausted, running on nothing but shock and fear. As Abby ate, Rose moved behind her and began to gently comb the tangles from her damp hair. Suddenly, Rose paused. Her expression changed. Mr. Carson, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Come see this. Nate walked over, his eyes following Rose's gaze. On Abby's shoulder, visible where the oversized nightgown had slipped down, was a mark. At first he thought it was a small wound, but as he looked closer, he realized it was something else. It wasn't a brand. It was more intricate, a symbol, a small, perfectly formed star with strange, delicate markings around it. What is this, Abby? Nate asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The girl's hand flew up to cover the mark. Her eyes were wide with fear. Papa said not to show anyone, she whispered. It's a secret. Rose and Nate exchanged a look over the child's head. What new mystery was this? It's all right, Rose soothed her, continuing to comb her hair. Your secret is safe with us. As she worked, Rose began to hum softly. It was a strange, haunting melody with a distinctly Eastern sound. To Nate's astonishment, after a moment, Abby began to hum along. You know this song? Rose asked, her surprise evident. Mama sang it to me, Abby replied. She said it was a lullaby from across the great ocean. It is a very old Chinese song, Rose confirmed. She switched from humming to singing the words in her native Mandarin. Abby listened, her head cocked to one side. Then she shocked them both by singing a few of the phrases back, her pronunciation seemingly perfect. That's how Mama sang it, she explained, seeing their stunned faces. Your Mama knew Chinese songs? Nate asked carefully. Abby nodded. Mama knew lots of languages. She studied people from all over the world. That's what Papa said. An anthropologist. That would explain their travels. But it didn't explain the mark on her shoulder, and it certainly didn't explain why James Blackwood wanted them dead. After Abby had eaten, a new problem arose. Where would she sleep? Nate's heart twisted. There was only one other bedroom upstairs besides his own. It had been his daughter's. The door had been closed for 5 years. No one had been inside. It was a shrine to his grief, the belongings untouched, as if waiting for a little girl who would never come home. He made the decision in an instant. You can sleep in Sarah's room, he told her. Rose gave him a sharp, surprised look. Who's Sarah? Abby asked, sensing his discomfort. My daughter, Nate said, the words still tasting like ash in his mouth. She and her mother, they died 5 years ago. Oh, Abby's voice was small. I'm sorry. It's all right, Nate said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. The room should be yours now. Sarah would have liked that. He led her up the stairs, each step an echo from the past. He opened the door and the air that greeted them was stale, thick with dust and memory. The small bed with its patchwork quilt, the wooden chest, the rocking chair by the window where Martha used to read stories, and on a shelf, a china doll, Sarah's most prized possession. It's pretty, Abby said, looking around with wide, tired eyes. As she climbed into the little bed, still clutching her own ragged doll, she looked so small, so fragile. Will the bad men come here? She asked, the fear creeping back into her voice. Nate sat on the edge of the bed. No one is going to hurt you here, he said with more confidence than he felt. I promise. As he stood to leave, her voice stopped him. Mr. Carson, could you leave the lamp on? Just a little bit? The simple request was a punch to the gut. Sarah used to ask the same thing every night. Of course, he said, his voice thick. He adjusted the lamp to a soft glow. Good night, Abby. Good night, Mr. Carson. Downstairs, Rose was waiting with a cup of coffee. What have I gotten us into, Rose? He asked, slumping into a chair at the table. You did what was right, she replied simply. The child needed help. You gave it. Blackwood won't let this go, Nate said. Whatever he was looking for, he thinks Abby knows where it is. Then we must discover it first, Rose said. She pushed a small worn leather pouch across the table. I found this in her things while she was bathing. Nate opened it. Inside there was a single folded photograph. He stared at it, and the blood drained from his face. There were 3 people in the photo, standing in front of what looked like a mine entrance. A man with a beard and intelligent eyes, Abby's father. A woman with Abby's unmistakable features, her mother. And standing between them with a friendly, comradely arm draped over Mr. Sullivan's shoulder was James Blackwood. They were all smiling. Colleagues, partners, friends. Nate turned the photograph over. On the back, written in a neat, careful hand, were 2 words. Expedition Sagrado, 1882. The Sacred Expedition. Nate stared at the image, a cold dread washing over him. This wasn't just a simple murder over a mining claim. This was a betrayal. 2 years ago, these people had been partners. Now 2 of them were dead, and the third was hunting their child like an animal. Whatever they had found on that expedition, whatever secret they had uncovered, It had been valuable enough to turn friends into killers. And that secret was now locked away somewhere inside the memory of the little girl sleeping in his daughter's bed upstairs. Sleep was impossible. Nate spent the night on the porch, his rifle resting across his knees, his eyes scanning the darkness. Every gust of wind, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was a soldier again, on watch in enemy territory. He kept thinking about the photograph, Blackwood and the Sullivans. What had they found out here in the dust and the rock? What was Expedition Sagrado? Around midnight, he heard a soft creak from inside the house. A moment later, Abby appeared in the doorway, a small ghost in Sarah's oversized nightgown. "Can't sleep?" Nate asked softly. She shook her head, her arms wrapped tightly around her doll. "I had a bad dream." "Want to sit out here with me for a while?" She padded across the porch and settled into the chair next to his. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the endless ocean of stars overhead. "It's so big," she whispered finally. "The sky? Yes, it is. Papa used to show me the constellations," she said, her voice small and sad. "He knew all their names." She pointed to a bright star in the northern sky. "That one. He said that was the North Star. He said it's special because it never moves. If you're ever lost, you can always find your way home by following the North Star." Nate nodded. "That's right. It's why I named this place the North Star Ranch. A reminder that even in the darkest night, there's always a light to guide you home." "But what if you don't have a home anymore?" she asked. The question hit Nate like a physical blow. It was the same question that had haunted him for 5 years. "I think," he said slowly, the words feeling strange and new in his mouth, "that home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's the people who care about you." She considered this with the solemn gravity of a child. "Like you? And Miss Rose?" He looked at her small, earnest face, illuminated by the faint starlight, and he found he couldn't deny it. "Yes," he said, "like me and Miss Rose." She seemed satisfied with this. After another moment of silence, she spoke again, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I saw him before. Mr. Blackwood. He came to our camp 3 days ago." Nate went still, every nerve ending on high alert. "He and Papa argued," she continued, pulling her knees up to her chest. "Mama told me to go collect flowers, but I hid and I listened. Papa told him to leave us alone, that he wouldn't be a part of it anymore. But Mr. Blackwood said Papa had made a promise, and he had to keep it." "Did your father say what the promise was about?" Nate asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Abby shook her head. "No, but that night, Papa told me we might have to leave quickly. He showed me where to hide if bad men came." Her voice trembled. "He said if anything happened to him and Mama, I should find someone good and give them something important." Nate's heart was pounding. "What was it, Abby? What did he want you to give them?" She looked up at him, her green eyes wide and swimming with unshed tears. "I don't know," she whispered. "He never had the chance to tell me." A single tear escaped and slid down her dusty cheek. "I tried to be brave, like he told me, but I was so scared." "You were very brave," Nate assured her, his voice rough with emotion. "You did exactly what your father told you to do." Eventually, her eyelids began to droop. Exhaustion was finally winning its war against fear. Nate gently scooped her up. She weighed almost nothing, and carried her back to Sarah's room. As he tucked her in, she murmured sleepily, her words slurring together. "Are you a good man, Mr. Carson?" The question, so innocent, so profound, stopped him cold. He looked down at this child who had every reason to distrust the world, yet was offering her trust to him. "I try to be," he answered honestly. "Papa said to look for the good ones," she mumbled, her eyes already closing. I think you're good." Long after she fell asleep, Nate stood by her bed, her words echoing in his mind. "I think you're good." It humbled him, and it terrified him, because he wasn't at all sure he could live up to it. The next morning the sun rose hot and unforgiving. Nate was down in the kitchen before the light hit the valley floor. Rose was already there, the scent of coffee and baking biscuits filling the air. "She had nightmares," Nate explained, taking a grateful gulp of coffee. She told me Blackwood visited their camp a few days ago. They argued about a promise. He showed Rose the photograph. They worked together. The U.S. Geological Survey. Rose examined the picture, her brow furrowed. This explains much. They were searching for something valuable. Gold, silver perhaps. But why kill over it? There are legal ways to settle mining disputes. Unless what they found wasn't on public land, Rose suggested thoughtfully. Or was something they were not supposed to find at all. Their conversation was cut short by the sound of horses, not one, but several riding into the yard. Nate was at the window in a second, his hand on his gun. A wave of relief washed over him. It was Sheriff Franklin Pierce, an old friend from the war, with two of his deputies. Stay with Abby, he told Rose, and went out to meet them. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Nate laid out the whole ugly story. Pierce listened intently, his face growing grimmer with every word. So the girl's upstairs now, he confirmed when Nate finished. Yes, Rose is with her. Pierce rubbed his jaw. Blackwood's not a man to cross, Nate. He's got friends in high places, all the way up to the governor. He's a murderer, Frank. That has to count for something. If we can prove it, Pierce sighed, the word of a traumatized child against a man with Blackwood's influence, it won't be enough. Just then, Rose appeared in the doorway, with Abby standing beside her. She was wearing one of Sarah's old dresses, which Rose had hastily altered. She looked less like a frightened ghost and more like a little girl again. Pierce smiled kindly at her. Hello there, young lady. I'm Sheriff Pierce. I'm a friend of Mr. Carson's. Abby looked him up and down with solemn eyes. Are you a good man, too? The question seemed to take the sheriff by surprise. He glanced at Nate, then back at the child. I try to be, just like Mr. Carson here. That seemed to be the right answer. She moved to stand beside Nate, her small shoulder just barely touching his arm. Abby, the sheriff said gently, can you tell me about the men who hurt your parents? There were 5 of them, she said, her voice small but steady. Mr. Blackwood was there. He kept asking Pop about the map, but Papa told him he'd destroyed it. Nate and Pierce exchanged a sharp look. A map. What map, Abby? Nate asked. I don't know. Papa had lots of maps. He was always looking for something important. Something sacred, he said. She hesitated. He called it Expedition Sagrado. The words from the back of the photograph. Nate pulled it from his pocket and showed it to her. She took the picture, her small finger tracing the faces of her parents. This was before, she said softly, when Mr. Blackwood was still Papa's friend. Do you know what they were looking for? Pierce asked. Abby shook her head. Papa said it was safer if I didn't know. But yesterday, Mr. Blackwood told Papa he had one last chance to tell him where it was. Papa said he'd rather die than let him find it. And then they shot him. Rose put a comforting hand on Abby's shoulder. Perhaps that is enough questions for now. Pierce nodded. You've been very brave, Abby. There's one more thing, Abby said suddenly. She held out the raggedy doll, the one she hadn't let go of since Nate found her. Papa said if anything happened, I should keep her safe. I think he hid something inside her. Nate took the doll. It was heavier than it looked. There was a hard lump in its torso. May I? He asked Abby, gesturing with his pocket knife. She nodded. He carefully slit a seam in the doll's back. Inside, nestled among the cotton stuffing, was a folded piece of oilskin. He gently pulled it out and spread it on the table. It was a map, a hand-drawn map, incredibly detailed, showing a network of canyons and strange rock formations. There were X's marked in several locations, with notes written in a bizarre code of symbols Nate had never seen before. And in the corner of the map was a symbol that made Nate's blood run cold. It was a star, identical to the one on Abby's shoulder. This is what they were after, Pierce said, his voice a low whisper. Abby leaned forward, studying the map. Papa showed me this, she said, surprising them all. He taught me the symbols. It was a game we played. You can read this? Nate asked, astonished. She nodded. Some of it. The X marks are special places. Places where the earth has secrets. She pointed to one of the X's. Papa said this one was the most important, the place where heaven touches earth. Before they could process this, Sheriff Pierce was getting ready to leave. He pulled Nate aside on the porch. "There's something else, Nate," he said, his voice low. Daniel Sullivan wasn't just any geologist. He was working for the federal government, investigating corruption in the territorial mining operations, illegal claims, bribes, the works. The pieces slammed into place with sickening force. "He'd uncovered evidence that could bring down some powerful people," Pierce continued, "including our friend Blackwood. This wasn't just about a lost mine. This was about a cover-up. Blackwood wasn't just a murderer. He was a cornered animal, fighting to protect his entire criminal empire." "Watch your back, Nate," Pierce warned as he swung into his saddle. "I'll wire the federal marshals in Phoenix. But until they get here, you keep that child close. She's the only one who knows what this map really means." As the sheriff and his men rode away, Nate looked back at the house. He could see Abby's small face watching him from the window. He had stumbled into a war. And at the center of it all was a little girl with a secret map, a strange mark on her shoulder, and a memory full of secrets she didn't even know she possessed. For the first time in 5 years, Nathaniel Carson had found something worth fighting for, and God help anyone who tried to take her from him. The days that followed were a strange mix of tension and peace. The ranch was on high alert, with armed men watching the perimeter day and night. But inside the house, something was changing. Abby's presence was like a spring thaw after a long, hard winter. There was laughter in the quiet rooms. There were flowers on the table. Nate found himself teaching her to ride on a gentle old palomino named Sunny. He watched her determined little face as she concentrated on holding the reins, and he felt a forgotten warmth spread through his chest. "Papa taught me a little," she said, patting the horse's neck. "We were always traveling. Mama said the answers we were looking for were scattered, like stars in the sky." "Answers to what?" Nate asked. She shrugged her small shoulders. "Papa's questions about the earth, and Mama's questions about the people who lived on it a long, long time ago." Later that afternoon, Joshua rode in, his face grim. "Riders coming, Mr. Carson. 2 of them, dressed like city folk. They're asking for Abigail Sullivan." Nate's blood went cold. "Get Abby inside with Rose," he ordered. "Tell her it's a game. A hiding game." He stood on the porch, his hand resting on his Colt, as the strangers rode into the yard. They were a man and a woman, both impeccably dressed. The man was tall and had the bearing of a military officer. The woman was elegant and beautiful, with a practiced, polished smile. "Mr. Carson?" the man called out, dismounting. "Captain George Reynolds. This is my wife, Eleanor. We received a telegram from the sheriff. We understand you've taken in our niece, Abigail Sullivan." "Niece?" Nate studied them. His eyes narrowed. He felt a prickle of suspicion on the back of his neck. "You're Mrs. Sullivan's sister?" he asked the woman. "Half-sister," she corrected smoothly. "A terrible tragedy. We've come to take Abigail home with us to San Francisco. She belongs with her family." "That's interesting," Nate said, his voice dangerously soft. "Abby mentioned her mother knew old Chinese lullabies." "Oh yes," Eleanor Reynolds replied without a blink. "Margaret was always fascinated by the Orient. Our father was a diplomat, you see. We spent several years in Peking." The lie was so smooth, so perfect, but Nate knew it was a lie, and it confirmed his deepest fears. These people were not who they said they were. He invited them inside, playing along. They presented him with official-looking court documents, signed by a judge in Prescott, granting them temporary custody of Abigail. It all looked legitimate. Too legitimate. "I'm afraid Abby isn't here at the moment," Nate lied, matching their deception with his own. "My housekeeper took her into town for supplies. They won't be back until evening." The couple exchanged a look of frustration. "Then we shall wait," the captain said, his friendly facade beginning to crack. The next hour was a tense, uncomfortable standoff. The Reynoldses grew more and more impatient. Then Rose came in from the kitchen with a tray of tea. As she served the elegant Mrs. Reynolds, Nate saw Rose's eyes fix on something behind the woman's ear. Her expression went rigid. As soon as she could, she pulled Nate into the kitchen. Her voice was a terrified whisper. "The woman has the mark," she said, her hands trembling. Behind her ear, a small tattoo, a black lotus flower. It is the sign of the Black Flower Tong in San Francisco. Nate felt a chill crawl up his spine. What's that? A criminal organization, Rose said, her voice tight with a terrible old anger. They traffic in opium and in women. Young girls, Mr. Carson. They steal them. My husband fought against them. Many Chinese families in San Francisco, they lost their daughters to these people. The horrifying truth slammed into Nate. They weren't here to give Abby a home. They were here to sell her, or worse. Where is Abby? He demanded. With Joshua, in the root cellar. I told her the hiding game was getting serious. Rose's face was a mask of fierce determination. I will not let them take her, Mr. Carson, not while I draw breath. Nor will I, Nate said. But they have legal papers. We need to stall them. We need time. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Rose's face. I have herbs, she said softly. Herbs that can make tea. Very interesting. Not harmful, but perhaps disorienting. It will give us a few hours. Nate didn't hesitate. He just nodded. Do it. Over the next half hour, Nate watched as the potent herbs in Rose's special tea began to work their magic. Captain Reynolds grew drowsy, his head lolling. His wife became agitated, then confused, asking the same questions over and over. I don't feel quite well, the captain finally mumbled. The heat affects many visitors from the coast, Nate said, helping the man to his feet. Why don't you rest for a while? We have a guest room upstairs. They were both barely conscious by the time Nate and Rose got them onto the bed. How long will they sleep? Nate asked. Until morning at least, Rose replied. Good, Mike, Nate said, heading for the stairs. That gives us time to disappear. He found Abby in the cool, dark root cellar, listening wide-eyed as Joshua told her stories about his childhood. Is the game over? She asked as Nate came down the ladder. The game has changed, Nate told her gently. Those people upstairs. They're working for Mr. Blackwood. We have to go somewhere safer. Somewhere they'll never find us. An hour later, Nate and Abby were riding west, into the rugged foothills that bordered the ranch. Abby rode in front of him, a small, determined bundle. They were fugitives now, running from a man who had the law in his pocket and a criminal gang at his beck and call. Are we running away? Abby asked as the lights of the North Star Ranch disappeared behind them. No, Nate replied, his voice grim. We're choosing our ground. Your papa was a wise man. He said choosing your ground is as important as choosing your weapon. They rode toward a place Nate knew from his early days on the ranch, an old abandoned line shack, perched high on a plateau, a tiny fortress with a commanding view of the surrounding wilderness. It wasn't much, but it was defensible, and it was secret. As darkness fell, they settled into the small, dusty cabin. Despite the danger they were in, a strange sense of peace settled over Nate. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone with his ghosts. Will you tell me a story? Abby asked as she climbed into one of the rough bunks. Nate hesitated. He wasn't a storyteller anymore. The parables and Bible stories he once knew felt like they belonged to another man's life. But looking at her small, hopeful face, he found he couldn't refuse. He told her a story he hadn't thought of in years. The story of a shepherd who had 100 sheep. But when one went missing, he left the 99 safe ones to go search for the one that was lost. I like that story, Abby whispered sleepily as he finished. I think you are like that shepherd, Mr. Carson. You found me when I was lost. Her words hit him harder than any bullet could have. He sat by the window for a long time after she fell asleep, his rifle across his knees, the weight of her trust settling on his shoulders. He was no shepherd. He was a broken man who hadn't even been able to save his own family. He was so lost in his thoughts that he almost missed it. A tiny pinprick of light bobbing in the darkness, far down the trail they had just traveled. A lantern, carried by a single rider. Someone was coming. Nate's hand tightened on his rifle. It could be Joshua, or it could be Blackwood's men. They must have found the ranch empty. The drugged imposters must have woken up. He moved silently to the door, melting into the shadows at the corner of the cabin. The rider was moving cautiously, picking their way up the treacherous trail. When they were about 50 yards out, Nate raised his rifle. That's far enough, he called out, his voice a low growl that carried in the still night air. "Identify yourself." The rider stopped short. "Nate, it's Frank Pierce. For God's sake, don't shoot." Relief washed over Nate, so potent it almost made his knees buckle. It was the sheriff. "What in the hell are you doing out here, Frank?" Nate asked as Pierce dismounted, looking exhausted and grim. The sheriff's next words made Nate's blood run cold. "Blackwood's made his move," Pierce said, his voice low and urgent. "He's filed formal charges against you, Nate. Kidnapping, interference with a legal guardian. There's a warrant out for your arrest." Nate stared at him, stunned. Blackwood wasn't just using hired guns and criminal gangs. He was using the law itself as a weapon. "Those people at the ranch," Nate said, "the Reynoldses, their papers were signed by a Judge Harmon." "The same judge who signed your arrest warrant," Pierce confirmed grimly. "Blackwood's got him in his pocket. I sent word to a different judge, an honest one named Harrison down in Tucson. He's on his way, but it will take him at least 2 days to get here." 2 days, it felt like a lifetime. "And it gets worse," Pierce said. He leaned in closer, his eyes dark with a terrible knowledge. "There are rumors about Blackwood, Nate. Things he did during the war. He was part of an unofficial unit. They specialized in extracting information from prisoners." The unspoken words hung in the air. Torture. "They say he never left any witnesses alive to testify," Pierce finished. A chill, colder than the desert night, snaked its way down Nate's spine. This was the man who was hunting them, a man who knew how to make people talk, a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted, and what he wanted was Abby. "If I'm not back in 3 days," Pierce said as he prepared to leave, "assume the worst. Take the girl and ride for Tucson. Judge Harrison will protect you there." After the sheriff disappeared back into the darkness, Nate stood for a long time, the silence of the night pressing in on him. He turned to find Abby awake, sitting up in her bunk, the blanket clutched around her small shoulders. "Are we in trouble?" she asked. "Mr. Blackwood is still looking for us," he said gently. "I heard what you said," she admitted, "about the map and the expedition." She looked at him, her green eyes shining in the dim lamplight. "Papa said if anything happened, I should give the map to someone good, someone who would know what to do with it." Her voice was filled with a simple, unshakable faith. "I think that's you. I think that's why I found you." The weight of her trust was both a burden and a gift. "I'll try, Abby," he promised, "but I need your help. Tomorrow you need to tell me everything you remember about that map, everything your father taught you." "I will," she promised. As she settled back to sleep, Nate felt a subtle shift inside him. This wasn't just about protecting a child anymore. It was about honoring the trust of a dying man. It was about finishing what Daniel Sullivan had started. Whatever dark secret was hidden in those canyons, whatever expedition Sagrado had uncovered, he would protect it. He would protect Abby, or he would die trying. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight painted the desert floor in shades of gold and rose, Abby sat at the rough-hewn table, a piece of charcoal in her small hand. She carefully drew the strange symbols from her father's map on a piece of scrap wood. "This one means water," she explained, pointing to a wavy line. "This one means a cave. And this one," she tapped an X surrounded by a circle, "this one is the most important. Papa called it El Corazon, the heart." "What's there, Abby? What did he find?" Her brow furrowed in concentration. "Something old. Something the Spanish left behind. Papa was excited when he found it. But he was also worried." "Worried about what?" "That bad people would use it wrong," she said, looking up at him. "He said some treasures aren't meant to be owned. They're just meant to be protected." Before Nate could ask more, he heard it. The sound he'd been dreading. Horses, not one or two. A lot of them. And they were moving fast. He was at the window in an instant, his rifle in his hand. "Get under the bunk, Abby, now!" She scrambled under the bed without a word. Through the window, Nate saw 4 riders cresting the nearest hill. For a heart-stopping second, he thought it was Blackwood. But the man in the lead was Joshua Miller, and his face was a mask of grim urgency. Nate met them outside. "What is it?" he demanded. "Blackwood's men raided the ranch at dawn," Joshua said, his words coming in ragged gasps. "A dozen of them. They tore the place apart looking for you. They burned the barn. Rose? Nate asked, his heart seizing in his chest. She's safe, hidden in the root cellar, but they're searching every inch of our land. It won't be long before they find this place. Joshua's eyes were dark with more bad news. And that's not the worst of it. Sheriff Pierce, they arrested him. Blackwood deputized his own hired guns. He controls the whole town now. They were completely cut off, outnumbered, outmaneuvered. We have to move, Nate said, his mind racing. I thought you might say that, Joshua replied, gesturing to a pack horse. Brought supplies, food, water, ammunition. Where are we going? Abby asked, her small face pale as she emerged from the cabin. Just then she stiffened. A strange, distant look came into her eyes. I remember something, she whispered. Papa told me about a place to hide, a place no one else knew, the abandoned church, near the ranch. He said it was built on special ground, sacred ground. The old Spanish mission. It had been crumbling into dust for decades. Most folks said it was haunted. It was the last place anyone would think to look. It's our best shot, Nate decided. Joshua, you and the men lead them on a wild goose chase. Head toward the Dragoon Mountains. Make it look like we're heading for the border. We'll circle back to the church. As they rode away, splitting from Joshua's group, Nate felt a growing certainty that they were hurtling towards some kind of endgame. The map, the sacred ground, the abandoned church, it was all connected. Daniel Sullivan had left them a trail of breadcrumbs, and Nate could only pray they were following it to a sanctuary, not a trap. They reached the old church as the afternoon sun began to bleed across the western sky. Its adobe walls were the color of the earth, crumbling and forgotten. Nate pushed open the heavy wooden door, and they stepped into a cavernous space filled with dust motes dancing in the shafts of dying light. Papa brought me here once, Abby said, her voice a hushed echo. He said the church was built on top of something older, something the Spanish found when they first came here. She walked with an unnerving confidence toward the spot where the altar had once stood. The floor here was made of large, fitted flagstones. Help me move this one, she said, pointing to a specific stone. Nate knelt down. He found a small, hidden indentation along the edge. With a grunt of effort, he pried the heavy stone up. Beneath it, in a small, dark cavity, lay a package wrapped in oilskin. This is it, Abby breathed. Papa's journal. He said if anything happened, I should find this and give it to someone who would understand. Nate unwrapped the package. Inside was a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Daniel Sullivan's neat scientific handwriting, and next to it, a small, heavy object. It was a metal disc, about the size of his palm, made of some kind of dark, burnished metal. It was covered in intricate engravings, the same strange symbols from the map. Papa called this the key, Abby whispered. Nate flipped through the journal. It was filled with geological notes, translations of old native legends, and references to Spanish expedition records. The last entry, dated just a week before Sullivan's murder, was chilling. Blackwood has threatened us directly. Claims I violated our agreement. He knows too much. The map is ready. Abby has memorized the key locations. God help us if he finds the entrance before we can secure it. The door must not be opened by those who seek only power. The door, La Puerta. Before Nate could ask what it meant, he heard it, the sound that had haunted their every step. Horses, outside, and they were close. Hide! Nate hissed, shoving the journal and the disc back into the package. The hole! Abby whispered urgently, pointing to the cavity in the floor. Papa said there's a room underneath. It seemed impossible, but as Nate tore at the adjacent flagstones, he revealed a narrow shaft descending into pitch darkness, an old priest's hole, a secret hiding place. You first, he ordered, helping Abby into the opening. He passed the package down to her, then scrambled to replace the stones. The heavy church door creaked open just as Nate lowered himself into the hole, pulling the final flagstone into place above him. He was plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. Footsteps echoed on the stone floor just inches above his head. He could hear voices, and one of them made his heart stop. It was James Blackwood. Search every corner, Blackwood commanded, his voice cold and sharp. They've been here. The girl would know where her father hid his research. His voice dropped, becoming hard as steel. Find them. Carson is expendable. But the girl must not be harmed. She is far too valuable. In the cramped darkness, Nate felt Abby press against him, her small body trembling. He wrapped a protective arm around her, listening as Blackwood's men ransacked the church above them. He heard them moving closer, their heavy boots scuffing the flagstones right over their heads. He held his breath, waiting for the shout of discovery, waiting for the end. But it never came. After what felt like an eternity, he heard Blackwood's frustrated voice. Nothing here. They must have moved on. Expand the search. Check the surrounding area. They can't have gotten far. The footsteps receded. The church door slammed shut. And then, silence. They waited in the blackness for over an hour, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. Finally, Nate decided it was safe. He struck a match. The small flame revealed they were in a chamber older than the church itself. The walls were covered in faint etchings, the same symbols from the disc. And in one corner, leading away into the darkness, was a narrow tunnel. Papa mentioned a passage, Abby whispered, for the priest to escape. They followed the tunnel, crawling through the tight, dark space. It sloped gently upward, and after 50 yards, Nate felt a breath of cool night air on his face. The tunnel ended in a small opening, concealed by rocks and brush on the hillside behind the church. They had escaped. But as they looked out over the dark, empty desert, a new reality set in. Their horses were gone. Their supplies were gone. They were on foot, miles from safety, with Blackwood's men scouring the countryside for them. And their only hope was a 60-mile journey on foot, through the brutal Arizona night, to the distant town of Tucson. Their journey through the night was a waking nightmare. They stumbled through rocky arroyos and thorny brush, every shadow a potential enemy, every sound a threat. Their water was almost gone. Abby, exhausted but uncomplaining, kept pace, her small hand clutching Nate's. Just before dawn, when Nate was starting to think they wouldn't make it, he saw it. A faint, flickering light in a shallow valley ahead. A homestead. It belonged to an old prospector named Tobias Hawkins, a grizzled loner who hated Blackwood almost as much as Nate did. Hawkins gave them water, food, and a place to rest. But he also gave them a warning. Blackwood's brought in a specialist, the old man rasped, a tracker from New Mexico, man named Reeves. They say he can track a ghost across a bare rock. Hawkins gave them his old wagon and a stubborn mule named Betsy. It wasn't fast, but it was better than walking. As the sun rose, they set out again, following a little-used trail that wound south toward Tucson. For a few hours, Nate allowed himself to hope. They had a head start. They were on their way to Judge Harrison, but the hope was short-lived. Around midday, he heard it, the rhythmic drum of hooves, fast and steady, coming up the trail behind them. 3 riders. The man in the lead was lean and weathered, with cold, dead eyes and a long, jagged scar down his cheek. Reeves. Get in the back and stay down, Nate ordered Abby. He whipped the mule, urging the stubborn animal into a jolting trot. The wagon bounced and rattled over the rocky terrain. A rifle shot cracked through the air, the bullet whining past Nate's ear. Another shot kicked up a cloud of dust just behind the wagon wheel. They were cornered. Nate steered the wagon off the trail into a narrow wash that curved around a hill. But as they rounded the bend, his heart sank. A dead end. A 20-foot drop-off where the wash had been carved out by ancient floods. They were trapped. "Abandon the wagon!" he yelled, grabbing the journal, the disc, and their canteen. He helped Abby down, and they scrambled up the rocky slope of the hill, seeking cover. They had almost reached the ridge when Reeves's cold voice called out, "That's far enough, Carson." He and his men were at the bottom of the hill, their rifles aimed. They were caught. "Blackwood wants the girl in the journal," Reeves said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Hand them over, and you might walk away." "Not happening," Nate growled, pushing Abby behind him. "Have it your way," Reeves shrugged. "Bring the girl down. Carson is expendable." As the men started up the hill, Nate made a split-second decision. "Run, Abby," he yelled, shoving her toward a narrow crevice between 2 boulders. "Follow the ridge. Don't stop! He raised his rifle and fired, providing cover as she squeezed through the opening. The next few moments were a blur of smoke and thunder. Nate fired, reloaded, fired again, keeping Reeves and his men pinned down. But he was out of time, out of ammunition. He was bracing for the final, fatal shot when a new sound erupted from behind Reeves. More gunfire, and a voice shouting his name. "Carson! It's Pierce!" Somehow the sheriff had escaped. He and a posse of men were charging up the trail, their guns blazing. Reeves and his men, caught in a crossfire, were forced to retreat. In the chaos, Nate scrambled through the crevice after Abby. He found her huddled behind a rock, shaken but unharmed. Joshua Miller was there, with fresh horses. "The sheriff got word to us," Joshua explained as they mounted up. "He said to get you to Judge Harrison in Tucson, no matter what." They rode hard for the rest of the day and through the night. It was nearly dawn when they finally reached the outskirts of Tucson and the large fortified home of Judge Harrison. The judge, a tall man with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes, met them at the door. "You've been through a terrible ordeal," he said, his voice kind but firm. "You are safe now. I've already been in contact with the federal marshals. They will take custody of Mr. Sullivan's research." As a housekeeper led an exhausted Abby upstairs to a warm bed, Nate handed the journal and the disc to the judge. He felt a profound sense of relief. It was over. But it wasn't. An hour later, Sheriff Pierce arrived, his arm in a sling. "We drove Reeves off," he said, "but we have bigger problems. Blackwood is gone. He's taken a group of his best men, and he's heading for the Dragoon Mountains." "The cave," Nate realized. "He doesn't have the key," Pierce said, "but he must have enough information to get close. He's going for it, Nate. He's going for the door." "Then we have to stop him," Nate said, the exhaustion falling away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. From the top of the stairs, a small voice cut through the tension. "You have to go." It was Abby. She was standing there in a borrowed nightgown, looking impossibly small and incredibly brave. "You have to stop him from finding the door," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You have to finish what my papa started." 2 hours later, Nate was riding east, at the head of a posse of a dozen grim-faced men. They were riding toward the Dragoon Mountains. They were riding into a final confrontation. They found Blackwood's camp at dawn, in a box canyon, just as Sullivan's journal described. His men were searching a sheer cliff face covered in ancient petroglyphs. "He hasn't found the entrance yet," Pierce whispered. They came up with a plan. Pierce would lead a diversion, drawing Blackwood's men away from the cliff. Nate, with Joshua and a few deputies, would circle around and use the disc to open the entrance. The canyon erupted in gunfire. As Pierce's men engaged Blackwood's forces, Nate and his group scrambled along a high, narrow ridge toward the cliff face. They were halfway there when a voice from above stopped them cold. "I underestimated you, Carson," said the tracker, Reeves. He was perched on a ledge above them, his rifle aimed right at Nate's heart. "Drop your weapons." They were trapped, helpless. But just as Reeves was about to fire, another shot rang out, from a completely different direction. Reeves jerked, his rifle clattering on the rocks as he toppled from his ledge. Sheriff Pierce stepped out from a hidden crevice in the cliff face. "Sullivan's journal mentioned a back door," he said with a grim smile. They raced to the main entrance. Nate took out the heavy metal disc. He found a circular depression in the rock that was a perfect match. He pressed the disc into place. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, grinding rumble, a section of the solid rock wall slid inward, revealing a dark, perfectly carved tunnel leading deep into the mountain. They plunged into the darkness. The tunnel opened into a vast, central chamber. And what they saw there made them all stop in their tracks, their mouths agape in stunned silence. The walls of the chamber glittered and gleamed. They were laced with thick, pure veins of solid gold. But it was the thing in the center of the room that stole their breath. It was a massive, intricate machine, a complex assembly of interlocking metal rings, strange crystals, and glowing conduits, all arranged around a central column that stretched up to an opening in the cavern's ceiling. A single perfect shaft of sunlight streamed down, illuminating the device. "My God," Pierce whispered. "What is it?" "Sullivan called it the mechanism," Nate said, his voice hushed with awe. He believed it was an ancient astronomical calendar, or something more. Something much more, said a voice from the tunnel entrance. It was Blackwood. He stood there, a revolver in his hand, a triumphant smile on his face. "Thank you, Carson," he said smoothly, "for opening the door for me." "It's over, Blackwood," Pierce growled. "On the contrary," Blackwood said, "it's just beginning. This isn't about gold, gentlemen. This is about knowledge. Knowledge is power, and the principles behind this mechanism, the military applications are staggering. There are governments that will pay a fortune for this kind of power." As he spoke, the shaft of sunlight hit a specific crystal on the central column. The entire machine began to hum, a low resonant frequency that vibrated through the stone floor. The crystals began to glow, casting strange, moving patterns of light across the cavern walls. It was a star map. The constellations wheeled and turned in an accelerated dance. "This isn't a weapon, Blackwood," Nate said, mesmerized by the display. "It's a library, a record of knowledge, preserved for centuries." "Knowledge that can be weaponized," Blackwood snarled, but even he seemed shaken by the spectacle. The hum grew louder, the light more intense, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The chamber was plunged back into semi-darkness. "Now," Blackwood said, regaining his composure, "the journal and the disc." But before anyone could move, they heard footsteps from the tunnel. A group of men appeared, armed and purposeful. At their head was Judge Harrison, and the men with him were wearing the badges of U.S. Marshals. "James Blackwood," the judge said, his voice booming in the cavern, "you are under arrest for murder and for conspiracy against the United States of America." Blackwood's response was a desperate final act of violence. He fired at the judge. In the chaos, Nate tackled him, wrestling the gun from his hand and pinning him against the glittering golden wall. "It's over," Nate said. For a moment, pure hatred burned in Blackwood's eyes. Then something inside him seemed to break. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I wasn't selling it. I was trying to save him." "Save who?" "My son," Blackwood choked out, the words torn from him. "He's in Boston. He's dying. The doctors, they can't do anything. But Sullivan's research, he found references. The people who built this place, they understood things. Healing, energy. I thought I could find a cure." The confession hung in the air, a shocking, humanizing twist in a story of greed and murder. It didn't excuse his crimes. It didn't bring back Abby's parents, but it cast the whole tragedy in a new, heartbreaking light. As the marshals led a broken James Blackwood away, Nate looked at the incredible, silent machine. It was a legacy, a gift from a long-forgotten past. And now, thanks to Daniel Sullivan and the fierce courage of his small daughter, it was safe. 3 days later, Nate stood on the porch of the North Star Ranch. He watched as Abby and Rose planted flowers in Martha's old garden. The world felt quiet, peaceful. Judge Harrison had granted Nate legal guardianship of Abby. The adoption was already in the works. The ranch, once a hollow shell filled with ghosts, was starting to feel like home again. A real home. That evening, as the first stars began to prick the deep purple sky, Abby sat on the porch steps next to him. "Papa used to say that stars are like people," she said softly. "Some burn bright but don't last long. Others are steady and constant. They guide us through the dark times." She pointed up at the familiar, unwavering light of the North Star. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time. Then she leaned her head against his arm. It was a small, simple gesture, but it meant everything. "Mr. Carson," she said, "when the adoption is finished, will I call you Papa?" Nate's throat tightened. He looked at this incredible, brave little girl who had walked through fire and come out the other side. This child who had lost everything, but had somehow found the strength to trust again, to love again. She had found him when he was lost in the wilderness of his own grief. She had been his North Star. "I think I'd like that very much," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd like that more than you know." If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption in the Old West, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know what other hidden treasures and dark secrets are just waiting to be uncovered.